Democratic nations across the globe have set up various systems, processes, and rules when it comes time to cast that oh-so-precious vote. In most nations, the voting age is 18, and where registering to vote is not compulsory, the number of registered voters hovers around 60 and 90% of the voting age population. And then, election day comes, and there is major slippage. The U.S. is the largest democracy with the lowest voter turnout. Yes, the 2016 presidential election did show a marked uptick in voter participation. It still pales in comparison to other Western democracies. Why is this? The barrier to casting a vote range from apathy to legality to geography to demography to simple scheduling. For some reason, Americans are committed to casting a vote on weekdays, Tuesday. Yet, very few employers actually provide time off to cast a vote. Other nations have their elections on weekends, which is a little more convenient. And of course, we have mail-in ballots. But those have their own set of distinct challenges. Okay. Let's say you hurdle all the barriers and are finally able to cast that vote. How do we know it was actually counted? How do you know that it wasn't tampered with? Now, as an American, we have a long, illustrious history of tampering in the elections of other countries, and after perhaps receiving a taste of our own medicine in 2016, it is becoming more and more apparent that we need a better voting system, more secure infrastructure, more transparent process. Now, Estonia is a shining example of a 21st century voting infrastructure, and many smaller nations are making big strides to improve the validity, the transparency, and the security of their elections. And this is just one arena where social innovators are working hard to improve how government functions. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking to Jeffrey Stern of Votem. Votem's a mobile voting platform designed to securely cast votes in elections across the globe. Now, I'm going to be talking with Jeffrey from Votem, and I just want to highlight Votem is one of many social innovators helping shift our democratic institutions into the digital age by improving the accessibility and the security of our sacred right to vote. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Daniel. I'm very excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share more about what we're doing at Votem.
Excellent. So before we jump into the meat of things, why don't you take a moment and tell us a bit about who you are and what you and the Votem team are up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jeffrey Stern. I'm a New Yorker masquerading as a Clevelander, and over the past few years have been working at Votem. We are a mobile voting company working to modernize our electoral infrastructure and make voting more secure and accessible for everyone. Simply put, we believe that every eligible citizen should be able to actively participate in democracy by easily and safely voting when, how, and where they would like to. And we find that democratic institutions generally subscribe to this, but have done little to make it a reality and implement it in practice. Personally, I came onto Votem as our first employee, and I've held a variety of roles ranging from co-authoring on our protocol to recruiting and market strategy and software development, fundraising, and today PR through our upcoming conversation. Technically, I'm our operations manager at the moment, though.
And how many are the current team at Votem?
We are just under 20 at the moment.
Oh, wow. So you've got a good-sized staff, I'd say.
Yeah, it's quite exciting. We've just recently brought on some more people and are actually currently looking to bring on some more. But, the team has grown pretty substantially over the past year or so.
Excellent. So to drill down a little bit more into what you were saying, how exactly is Votem improving voting for voters, elected officials, voting enforcement agencies, just all the different stakeholders in the voting process?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, I think, because it gets at the heart of most of what we're doing and our motivations and our objectives. So if you just take a look back on the last year and some change, unfortunately, this past year has borne witness to some of the worst democratic crises in the 21st century. In Afghanistan, you have at least 57 people who were killed as they stood in line to register to vote. In Venezuela, you have a president who claimed a victory in really what was a sham election, announcing election results that were drastically different from certified actual tallies. In Kenya, you had improper reporting in the country's presidential election, such that the Supreme Court was forced to completely annul the results and call for an entirely new contest. And you consider the fact that voter trust is really fundamental to a sound democratic process, and without it, the election results bear little to no value to those participating. And I would argue that in our current society, there actually exists a crisis of trust, which represents a tremendous civic problem. And just to throw some numbers at that, trust in government institutions and democratic practices is actually waning, and today is at historic lows. In the 2016 election here in the States, only 29% of Americans were confident that their vote was counted as they intended it to be. And only 2/3 of Americans were confident that all the votes were counted as intended. So, if you take stock of what the current election space looks like, you find millions of voters who don't really trust the process, millions more who don't vote because they physically can't make it to the polls. And we'll touch a bit more on that, I imagine. And also an election infrastructure that, for the most part, has been architected and built many years before the first iPhone even came out.
Right.
And so we're focused on voting because we see a real opportunity to bolster trust by creating voting infrastructure that is accessible and independently and easily verifiable by both, election management bodies and individually by each voter and the other agencies that you talked about. And specifically, if you think of the ways that we're actually improving the process, we are really trying to restore trust in the electoral process. We're trying to make it easy to vote and impossible to cheat. And we're trying to increase transparency throughout all of it. And those, ideas, I think, kind of break down into 4 components related to verifiability, accessibility, security, and transparency. And I think those are really our core competencies and the areas where we're improving, voting for all those parties that you mentioned.
So have you and the Votem team implemented your product in an actual election yet?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does that look like from the end user perspective? I'm a voter in said country. What's the different experience that I am on the Votem system?
Yeah, so first off, it might be helpful just to clarify a bit, the legality of what I'm about to talk about, because I say online voting, but I do say that in air quotes, so you can't see my fingers going up and down. But basically what online voting refers to in the context of elections, at least here in the U.S., is limited in scope to this body of people classified as UOCAVA voters, which is an acronym that essentially just means anyone who's a member serving in the military or other expatriate citizens. So we're talking about people living abroad, and in certain situations we're talking about people with accessibility considerations. And the reason that online voting, which specifically refers to the online delivery, return, and marking of ballots for those voters, is an option was because, unfortunately, if you look at turnout rates for this demographic, you actually find that they are of the most disenfranchised of any in the country. So turnout rates were about 4%, and that's relative to a national average of mid-50s. So you have this really sad irony where the people who are the very people putting themselves on the line for the democratic process are the ones kind of most disenfranchised from it. And so that was recognized at a governmental level, and legislation was put in place to allow for this online delivery and return of ballots specifically for this demographic because the Postal Service and other means of participation had proven so historically disenfranchising. So when I refer to online voting in the States, that's mostly what I'm referring to. But yeah, that is something we have supported for governments, in addition to a slew of other services related to online voter registration or the actual administrative setup of elections themselves.
And so once one of these, our service members overseas cast a vote on the Votem system, how do they track that their vote was actually counted, that the verifiability, transparency that you're speaking to earlier?
Yeah, so to the verifiability point, the mark of a successful election is one where you may not be happy with the results, but you are provided sufficient evidence or proof that the results are accurate.
Right.
Right. So it's not really enough for the election to produce the correct outcome. The electorate must also be convinced that the outcome reflects the will of the people. Right. So if you've convinced the loser that they have lost, you've probably administered a election of high integrity. And most of the convincing derives from this presence of evidence that verifies the accuracy and integrity of the process. There's an academic notion of end-to-end voter verifiability that essentially guarantees three things. One of which is that a vote was cast as intended, meaning that a voter can independently verify that their selections are recorded correctly. Right. So, I mean, the obvious example there is in a paper analogy. If you are marking a paper ballot, you see that your vote has been selected as you intended it for the most part. And you run into issues with user experience and butterfly ballots and things that have proven historically problematic, but that's one piece of it.
Yeah.
The second is that a vote can be collected as you actually cast it. So that means that voters can independently verify that the representation of their vote is correctly collected for the tally. So you have both of those things, which kind of compound on each other. And then lastly, you have that the vote can be tallied as it was actually collected. So meaning that anyone can verify that every vote is correctly included in the tabulation of results. So our system, adheres to this academic notion of end-to-end verifiability. It does so in kind of a novel way. We've coupled blockchain and end-to-end verifiability in such a way that we've created this kind of irrefutable digital chain of custody that provides the mathematical proof that the integrity of the process was preserved and that the counts are correct, and that those participating can actually verify those transactions as they transpire. And so relative to a traditional voting process where historically a military person serving on the ship off the coast of a country in the Middle East would have to send in a ballot, may not ever get back to the States in time, may not even make it back to the States. No way for that person to know if it was counted correctly, if it was handled correctly. So you no longer have to blindly trust in a black box process where votes are counted and handled out of sight and hope for the accuracy of it. We've kind of built in this instant verifiability so that people who are inclined to can actually check that the system is working as it should.
And in these elections where you've implemented the Votem protocol, have you seen an uptick in voter turnout?
Yeah, and we're working more on kind of building out a more empirical, body of work to support, the narrative that, which is obviously the one that comes to mind mostly for people, which is that, the easier you make it to vote, the more people will actually turn out. That is something we've seen with the work we've done in Montana. Most of the private elections that we've done, people who are transitioning from paper to digital processes are, witnessing like as high as like 4x turnouts. But the important part, the piece of that that's really cool is that in the aftermath of the 2014 election, and this is related, I think, to this concept of accessibility, the U.S. Census Bureau surveyed just under 50 million Americans on why they did not vote. And of those who responded to that question, 53% of those respondents stated their inability to make it to the polls. So that means we're talking about tens of millions of people here, which is a pretty significant portion of the eligible population who are not voting because they cannot vote. And so we have this kind of hyper-focus at Votem on accessibility, which is a point I feel is actually lost right now in the national rhetoric, which is kind of hyper-focused on security, but without a lot of consideration given to the fact that there are a lot of people who are just currently physically unable to vote, and this alternate medium allows for secure and convenient participation, and that's easily been the most exciting thing about the work that we've done with voters in Montana. For example, the feedback that we've gotten is pretty extraordinary and positive, related to how difficult it was before and how appreciative they are of how easy it is to do it now.
So for those voters in Montana, would they download an app and then cast their vote via that app?
So the way it works in Montana, and again, this is particularly prescribed by the Uwakava voting laws. Each state kind of mandates their own version of it, because all elections in the U.S. are controlled at a state level rather than at the federal level. Mm-hmm. Certain states allow for different types of returns. So some, for example, might just allow email, which is not great for a few reasons. Some just allow for web portals. Some are fax. Some are still just postal. Some are different combinations. So in Montana, you would essentially follow the same exact process you would for a postal absentee ballot. So you still have to file a federal form requesting your online ballot, which you are sent within a set time period prior to the election. I believe it's 45 days, and then you, from the comfort of your own phone, can go through that ballot and fill it out online, and depending again on the state, either return it through a web portal, via email, print it out and mail it back, and depending on which medium you've gone through allows for different types of tracking. But the vision for us is certainly one where, think of like an Amazon package. You can see at every single step of the process what is happening. If something has gone wrong, remediation steps if something has gone wrong, ability to, like I mentioned, verify that everything is working as it should.
And so given the challenges that the state-by-state voting systems pose to, somebody like your team, somebody like yourself, who is looking to implement a solution, are you focused on growing Votem in a certain geography? Or what's your roadmap for implementation?
Yeah, we are focused on the U.S. at the moment. Obviously, we're based here in the U.S. Our customers span U.S. Jurisdictions: state of Montana, Washington, D.C., the city of Detroit, L.A. County. But we also have a slew of different private election customers. So think, professional associations, organizations, labor unions, award ceremonies, student groups, those types of bodies. But if you kind of take a step back and look at the international space, it kind of paints a different picture. So online voting, which again, I say in air quotes, which is legal in about 34 states, is a pretty limited deployment of this kind of technology. Internationally, though, there are more than 30 countries to varying degrees of scale and implementation that have taken a relatively technologically progressive approach to modernizing their election infrastructure by trialing and deploying online voting and other election technologies. Online voting actually dates as far back to 2004, where it was first used for a national statutory election in Estonia. And since then, a lot of international work has been done with biometric voter registration, secure digital identities and identity management, blockchain-based systems, and other technologies that could help improve electoral integrity going forward. So, we're currently focused here on the U.S. There's a lot of opportunity for us, I think, to better our current, election infrastructure
Right.
Here, but the opportunity is clearly greater than that.
Absolutely. So that's kind of what I'd like to hear about next is, with any effort, there's a certain amount of wind in your face, but also wind in your back. So what's supporting you in improving voting systems, and also what are the barriers to changing our current voting infrastructure?
Yeah, both of those are actually pretty extensive. I think a lot of what has come in the aftermath of this last election, with legitimate fears of foreign state involvement, is a double-edged sword where you have a persistent reminder that our electoral systems are currently vulnerable, but also this kind of real fear and aversion to trying anything new. So it's a tricky line we're trying to walk between those two very real and understandable perceptions that our society has right now. But on the supporting side, there's a lot of jurisdictions that are less focused on paying down this technological debt that we've acquired in our systems, and are actually kind of trying to reimagine what the system could look like going forward. And I'd highlight the work that we're starting to do with LA County. So LA has been working on this initiative called the Voting Solutions for All People. They call it the VSAP project. And the idea was to replace the county's aging voting systems that kind of lack the technical and functional elasticity necessary to continue to accommodate a growing and increasingly diverse electorate, to a new system that would make it easier for voters with accessibility considerations or voters with limited English proficiency to cast the ballot, and would feature a totally independent, open source, developed tally system that's actually by the county. So the piece that we're specifically working on is called the interactive sample ballot, which would allow for voters to mark their choices on their device or their computer anywhere, anytime from their home, and they could then create a digital representation of that ballot, for example, in the form of a QR code that a person could then have actually scanned physically at a voting center, which would pre-populate a paper ballot that a voter could choose to either just submit at that point or review and change something and submit. So the project is really kind of cool, and I think is an effort worth highlighting of what people are trying to do to better the system and support the work we're doing, because it gets people comfortable with the introduction of technology into the process.
Right, it's a bridge from the current system that we're familiar with to the system that we need for more accessibility, transparency, verifiability. It's brilliant.
Exactly. And then, on the flip side, we could probably talk a whole nother podcast about this, but what I think is pretty interesting is that even if you talk to our most doubtful skeptics, so these are credentialed academics, real election systems experts, you'll find that there's actually a consensus that it's a matter of when and not if we realize digital democracy, right? So we're in a world today where mobile transactions are long past the point of ubiquity and global adoption.
Right.
You have more than 5 billion people who are using mobile phones to increasingly do their banking, payments, shopping, taxes, communication, and frankly, their whole life online. So it's truly hard to envision the future of democracy where elections remain void of technology and modern design practices. So if you kind of take that and agree that at some point in the future we will realize this, we will have online voting, it then becomes a question of what are the challenges that need to be overcome for us to get there. And today there exists this wide gap between that inevitability and progress made being towards it. And I would argue that the barriers to change is more one of public perception. And I think that most people assume the biggest barrier, the biggest thing kind of holding this space back is technology. But from what I've seen, that's not actually the case. So you could, in theory, have a 1,000% hack-through system that is forever correct. But if people are not convinced of that, then doubt persists, which chips away at overall confidence.
Right.
And it's actually very difficult to prove that a system is truly immune to attack. you can do kind of what we're doing to provide proof that an election is verifiably correct, but not the whole state of the system. It's like trying to prove a universal non-existence. It's just very hard to do. And so as a barrier, in that same vein, in the minds of a lot of skeptics, there exists an omnipotent hacker who is easily capable of undetectable alterations to vote outcomes, which leads to this argument that insists that the existence of any imaginable risk of possible electoral exploitation is just unacceptable in the presence of these hypothetical, super powerful adversaries, which is difficult because in practice, this standard to which voting systems are held is not ever applied to any other human affair.
Right.
If such a system was actually enforced, it would totally invalidate the standing of any currently implemented system. The mere existence of risk does not, preclude our adoption of other technologies that have introduced new risks. Right? We don't outlaw automobiles for the roughly 40,000 annual deaths caused by cars because compromises are made to optimize for, the trade-off between the technology's realized human benefit and its potential harm. Right? Work is constantly being devoted to lessen the number of automobile deaths. So you have to mitigate the risk to control for the likelihood of any threat actually happening and for the effect that threat may have. And you also have to remember that these election technologies don't just exist in isolation of process and people and regulation and supporting systems. I think that the barrier often assumes that they do, and kind of foregoes any consideration for all the support that actually exists to catch something if stuff goes wrong. So it's really kind of a long-winded way to say that I think public perception and perspective can be kind of a barrier to adoption in the space right now.
No, it's very well said. And I love the metaphor you use there about the risk, technology, cars. It makes a lot of sense. So, I used to work in grassroots organizing and local politics, and voting is one upgrade that our democratic institutions need, but I'm curious as to what other good governance efforts are you interested in or excited about that are being forwarded in the space right now?
Yeah. On the technology side, I think there's actually a lot of really exciting work being done on governance, specifically in the world of blockchain. It's somehow become a sexy topic at the moment, which is pretty funny to me, but it's up there with scalability and decentralization, and all these blockchain frameworks are trying to figure out how you take the will of your network owners, respectively, and reflect that into the governance framework itself. Right? So you have Bitcoin, Ethereum, EOS, Tezos, Cosmos, among many others. And in my mind, they're just this really cool set of experiments where they're experimenting with tokens and liquid democracy and quadratic elections and on-chain versus off-chain voting. And, we don't really know what mechanisms work most effectively yet, and kind of just working through the trade-offs there. But I think it's a super exciting space to watch, and as people, figure out what actually works.
And what about outside the blockchain space? I know there's folks like Fair Vote who are pushing ranked choice voting as a good governance measure. What else is out there that we should be privy to?
Sure. There's, a lot of nuance to democratic decision-making. And I think, we have at Votem kind of taken a approach that is, one way, but on the other side of things, I think a bit more, out there, frankly, is this whole concept of liquid democratic voting, which is a really cool idea. Democracy Earth is working on it. Essentially, the idea is that, everyone still has the right to their own vote, but you can actually delegate it to someone who you believe to be more qualified on a specific topic to make that vote on your behalf, who can actually continue to delegate your vote and their own vote to someone else who they believe is more qualified. And at any point in the process, you can pull back or revoke your vote. And, in theory, I think think it's really cool. I know there are a few candidates that are running on that platform. The thing that's actually kind of most exciting about it to me is that it's not really even in conflict with what we're doing here at Votem, because underneath all of that, you still have to have this concept of end-to-end verifiability. But
right.
But it's cool to see all the work being done on that front, and just a lot of people. Again, I think all the experiments being done right now are pretty exciting to watch, because a lot of people are trying new things and trying to make things better, whether that be through liquid democracy or ranked choice voting. How do you best express the will of the people that your government represents?
I'm right there with you. It's really exciting time to see all the experiments going on. And as somebody who's on the front lines of this work, what recommendations do you have to others who are efforting to improve governance structures?
I think you need patience, and you need perseverance simultaneously. So, one of the things that we've realized pretty quickly here at Votem is that, and this will maybe sound silly, but it was actually really hard to create an election startup in the first place because when you're dealing with government institutions, these really large organizations, very slow to move, and understandably very risk averse and conservative in the adoption of new technologies, for really the reason that they're extraordinarily well intentioned in trying to do the best that they can, and taking on risk means that they're making it more likely that something will go wrong, and that a headline comes out about them. And it's very rare in this industry that someone gets a positive, grateful thank you article for doing a good job. It's really one where you only get recognized if something has gone wrong. So you need this patience and perseverance, because things will take longer than you think. But frankly, as I reflect on our time here at Votem, it's pretty crazy to me how much we've actually been able to accomplish, even though kind of on a day-to-day, it can be frustrating with how slow it seems things are moving. But, relative to where we were with, deployments and actual people trialing this stuff, it's pretty exciting to see how the industry is progressing. And, it goes back to that question of, there's this consensus that in the future, we'll get there. Well, is that, 2 years? Is that 5 years? Is that 10 years? And, I think we're pretty quickly chipping away, but it definitely requires perseverance.
So because we're speaking in English, I'm just going to focus this next question on America. As an American citizen, we're not asked to do too much when it comes to governmental participation. Once every 2 years, plus some special elections, we're asked to vote. So I'm interested in hearing what's one thing that citizens can do to improve government besides voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that is quite topical in today's world would just be to practice responsible share of information, and to try and be your own fact checker, and kind of approach the national rhetoric from a place of humility, and trying to actually build the right story, because it's become pretty clear that there's quite a problem of what is true and what is not true, and what is what do people trust, and it goes back to voting, like I mentioned. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. So I believe it could be quite beneficial and ameliorating for our society and government's well-being if more people practice responsible sharing of information.
That's a good one. Jeff, I so appreciate your time and the work you're doing. So before we wrap up, any last words, suggestions, calls to action?
Yeah. I would remember that, and this is particularly in light of a lot of articles that have come out recently related to, blockchain as it relates to elections. And, from Votem's standpoint, we're not claiming that blockchain is a panacea for all of digital democracy's problems. It's really just a tool that we're using with specific applications that solves a lot of the problems that historically have been difficult to solve. And at the end of the day, we're here just trying to make the whole process more accessible and secure for everyone participating, and that there are a lot of solutions out there, Votem among them, that can actually reach a balanced harmony between accessibility and security. It's not a binary decision between the two of those. I guess, secondly, I've definitely thrown out a lot of statistics, so I would be more than happy to follow up with the sources of those in the spirit of practicing what I just said about responsible sharing of information. And, finally, go out and vote. Like you mentioned, Daniel, it's one of the few things that we have the privilege of doing here as it relates to, our interaction with the government. And if you cannot do that for, whatever reason, reach out to your representative and ask for an alternate and secure, accessible medium of participation.
Democracy is not a perfect system. And, as has been proven time and time again, democracy seems to be the best tool humans have to increase and improve quality of life for the most amount of people. Our democratic institutions are desperately in need of an upgrade, as what was true 200 years ago is not true today. Organizations like Votem, Fair Vote, Agora, and many others are leading the charge to help democracy be more democratic. And in this volatile environment we live in, it is vital that the institutions we rely upon become more flexible, more transparent, and more secure to ensure our society can continue to rely on them for the imperative role they play in the day-to-day lives of citizens from Eureka to Estonia to Uganda and beyond. If you want to learn more about good governance initiatives and how to impact the governance system, these democratic institutions, I encourage you read Sidewalk Strategies by Larry Tramutola. Why David Sometimes Wins. Leadership, Organization, and Strategy in the California Farm Worker Movement by Marshall Gans. And finally, Wiki Government. How technology can make government better, democracy stronger, and citizens more powerful by Beth Simone Novak. A big thanks to my sponsor, Jay Lately, for providing the music for Onwrd. Jay Lately is a hip-hop artist who's been pursuing his dream since the age of 16 while juggling jobs that improve the lives of youth in Oakland. If you like good music and want to support independent artists, please go check out soundcloud.com/justlately. Thank you for taking the time, the interest, and showing your support by tuning in. If you'd be so kind as to share this with your audience, I would be extremely grateful. Keep up the good work. Onward and upward.